The gun smelled like machine oil and lemon polish, which was strange because nothing about the room it was pointed in should have smelled clean. 11 people stood against the tile wall of the kitchen with their hands laced behind their heads. One woman did not. She held a paring knife loose at her side like it was a spoon, and when the Don's finger found the trigger, she said his mother's killer's name out loud, into the silence, like she was reading a grocery list. The gun did not fire. Not yet. It wasn't a confession. It was an accusation, and it landed on him like cold water down the collar. Rewind 6 days. Rosa Calder smelled like burnt sugar and bleach, the two smells that never left her hands, no matter how many times she washed them under the scalding tap in the back of Lucchese's, the diner on 9th that had been failing quietly for 11 years and loudly for the last 2. She was 34. She had a body that ached in specific, catalogued places. The left knee from 4 years on a concrete floor, the right wrist from 4,000 identical flips of a sauté pan. The small of her back from nothing in particular, just time, just standing. Her sneakers were held together with electrical tape, black over white, and she had learned to walk in a way that kept the tape from peeling on wet floors. She owned 3 shirts for work and rotated them so precisely that Dom once accused her of buying a 4th, as if a 4th shirt were an extravagance a woman like her had no business affording. She had not bought a 4th shirt. She had learned, instead, to wash the collar by hand at night so the grease ring wouldn't set. She was $340 short for rent. Not $300, not $350, $340, a number she had recalculated 11 times that week, the way other people recalculated the odds of rain, turning it over on the bus, on the walk home, in the 2 minutes before sleep, when the ceiling of her apartment revealed the same water stain shaped, unhelpfully, like a state she'd never visited. The apartment above the laundromat on Delancey had a landlord named Petrosky who did not raise his voice, which was somehow worse than a man who did. He left notes, small yellow notes, taped at eye level on her door, block letters, never a signature, as if the anonymity of the handwriting made the threat more official. The newest one said Friday, no exceptions. This time, she had read it 4 times before she let herself go inside, because reading it in the hallway meant she didn't have to look at it again once she was home. Her cat, a 14-pound orange Tom named Butcher, ate a very specific and very wrong bag of food. The store-brand salmon pate, not the chicken, because the chicken gave him something Rosa didn't have the money to have a vet explain to her twice. She'd learned this the hard way, an $80 emergency visit 2 winters back that had eaten a week's tips and taught her, permanently, to read every label twice. She bought boxed wine from the bodega on the corner, the kind with a spigot, because a $6 box lasted 11 days if she was careful, and a $9 bottle lasted 3 if she wasn't, and the math mattered more than the taste ever could. At Lucchese's, she was furniture. The owner, a heavy-set man named Dom who wore 3 gold rings and no wedding band, called her Hey instead of her name, roughly 60% of the time, and on the other 40% he called her Ro, which she hated more, because it implied a familiarity he'd never once earned. The regulars looked through her the way you look through a window, seeing the street beyond and never the glass. A man in booth 4 had been coming in for 6 years and still asked, every single time, if they had a menu in Spanish, though she'd told him, every single time, that she was born 4 blocks from where they were sitting. She had trained at a culinary school in Queens that closed the year she graduated, its accreditation revoked, in a scandal nobody bothered to explain to the students who'd already paid $22,000 for the privilege of a diploma that opened no doors. She had once, before the aching knee and the burnt sugar hands, plated food that made men in suits stop mid-sentence, forks halfway to their mouths, silence falling over a table, the way it falls when something is simply, undeniably right. Nobody at Lucchese's had ever seen that woman. They only saw the one who mopped up after the fryer overflowed and said nothing when Dom docked her 20 minutes for it, because 20 minutes of pay wasn't worth the argument, and the argument wasn't worth the job, and the job, God help her, was still, somehow, the thing standing between her and worse. She had a knife roll, real leather, cracked now at the seams, a gift from a teacher who believed in her before belief got expensive. She kept it wrapped in a plastic bag in her locker so the leather wouldn't smell like the kitchen, wouldn't smell like grease and bleach and 11 years of somebody else's decisions. It was the only thing in her life she still protected the way you protect a person. That Tuesday, the Tuesday that would turn out to be the last ordinary Tuesday of her life, she worked a double, 7 to close, and Dom cut her final hour because a table walked out on a $34 check and someone had to pay for it, and it wasn't going to be Dom. She walked the 11 blocks home instead of taking the bus because 11 blocks was $2.75 she didn't have to spend, and she counted the blocks the way she counted everything now, out loud in her head, a private arithmetic nobody else could hear. There was a version of Rosa's life, once, that hadn't required this kind of counting. She remembered it the way you remember a country you visited as a child, vivid in fragments, unreliable as a whole. Culinary school had felt, for 2 years, like standing in a doorway with light on the other side of it. Knife skills drilled until her hands stopped shaking around a blade. A stage at a restaurant in the West Village, where a chef with a name people recognized had tasted something she'd made and gone quiet in a way that meant something. She had believed then that the doorway led somewhere. The school's accreditation collapsed 8 weeks before graduation, taking the diploma with it, and no West Village chef came looking for a student whose credential had turned to smoke. She had sent 40 resumes that year. She had gotten 3 callbacks and 1 job at a diner on 9th Street, meant to be temporary the way a lot of things are meant to be temporary before they simply become your life. She thought about that doorway sometimes, standing over the diner's flat top at 2 a.m. with nobody left to feed, scraping carbon off a grill that would only get dirty again in 6 hours. She did not let herself think about it often. Thinking about it too long made the 11 blocks home feel longer than they were. 9 miles away, in a stone house behind a gate that had cost more than Rosa would earn in 6 lifetimes, Salvatore Greco smelled like cedar and gun oil, a combination that made grown men's hands shake when they caught it walking up behind them. He was 51. He ran the ports from Red Hook to Sunset, and half the ports nobody in this city admitted existed at all. He had not raised his voice in 11 years, not once, not even the night his youngest cousin overdosed in a car 2 blocks from this very house. Fear had learned to anticipate him the way a dog learns a car engine's specific rattle 3 blocks before it turns the corner, and men who worked for him had learned to read the set of his jaw the way sailors read weather. Tonight, he had a clock, and the clock was a person. 11:42, 18 minutes. In 18 minutes, a cargo container sat in a customs yard in Newark with $2.3 million of product inside a false floor built into the container's second skin, a floor that had cost $60,000 to fabricate and that had, until 4 hours ago, been a certainty. In 18 minutes, a customs inspector who had been paid $14,000 to look elsewhere would finish his shift and be replaced by one who had not been paid anything at all, because the money for the second inspector's silence, $9,000, already wired, had somehow, impossibly, not bought what it was supposed to buy. 18 minutes, and 11 men standing in the stone house's kitchen because that was where the emergency dinner had been laid. Untouched now, a rack of lamb going cold under a heat lamp nobody remembered to turn off, its fat congealing white and stubborn along one badly rendered shoulder. Salvatore had inherited the ports the way other men inherit a watch, abruptly, at a funeral, with instructions he'd had to work out for himself afterward. His father had run things loud, the old way, fists on tables and voices that carried through brick walls, and Salvatore had learned, watching that, exactly what he didn't want to become. Loud men got indicted. Loud men got their names in newspapers, their faces on the 6 o'clock news standing outside a courthouse with a coat over their handcuffs. Salvatore had spent 11 years building a silence so total around himself that federal agents who'd wiretapped half his known associates had almost nothing on tape with his voice in it, because his voice was rarely the instrument he used. A raised eyebrow ended careers. A cancelled dinner invitation ended lives, sometimes literally, and everyone in the 5 boroughs who needed to know that fact already did. Tonight's emergency was the kind that tested even that kind of control. $2.3 million was not, by itself, enough to rattle him. He'd absorbed bigger losses before without blinking, treated them the way other executives treated a bad quarter. What rattled him was the shape of the failure. A paid man who had, for reasons nobody could yet explain, stopped staying paid. On the exact night a call had gone out from somewhere inside his own kitchen. Coincidence was a word Salvatore did not believe in the way other people believed in luck or God. Somewhere in the 11 men standing against his tile wall was the reason the arithmetic had stopped adding up, and he intended to find it before the 18 minutes ran out, because after that, the arithmetic would no longer be a problem he could solve quietly. The men against the wall were not there by accident. One of them, a capo named Enzo Bruno, had made a call 4 hours earlier that he believed private, standing on the fire escape of his sister's apartment in Bensonhurst, with the phone cupped against the wind. It had not been private. Salvatore did not shout this fact into the room. He set his gun on the counter, beside the cold lamb, with the specific quiet of a man setting down a fork between courses, and the 11 men understood, without being told twice, that someone in the room was about to stop breathing. 11 men, Salvatore said, not loud. And one of you made a phone call tonight you shouldn't have made. He walked the length of the counter, unhurried, the sound of his shoes on stone the only sound in the room besides the hum of the heat lamp. I'm not going to ask who. I already know who. I'm going to give the room 90 seconds to decide if anybody wants to say something before I decide what happens next. Nobody said anything. Bruno's hands, laced behind his head like everyone else's, had begun to shake, a tremor visible even from across the room. The kind of tremor a scared man can't will away no matter how still he tries to stand. The clock kept moving. 11:44. 16 minutes. Rosa Calder, at that exact moment, was walking home along 9th Street with a Tupperware of unsold soup she wasn't technically allowed to take, $3 and change in her apron, and a text from Petrosky she hadn't opened yet because she already knew what it said. She had no idea that 9 miles away, a man was counting down 16 minutes against a container full of money and a room full of men whose fear of him had calcified into something almost religious. The line crossing happened because Rosa took a wrong turn, or rather, because Dom made a decision that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with $20. Lucchese's had a service contract, off the books, cash, the kind Dom didn't ask questions about, with a catering outfit that did private events for people who paid in envelopes instead of checks. That night, short-staffed, Dom had shoved a foil pan of braised short ribs into Rosa's arms and told her to run it to a house on the water because the usual driver had a flat, and $20 extra was $20 extra, and $340 minus $20 was $320. Still a wall, but a shorter one, and shorter walls were the only kind of progress Rosa's life had offered her lately. She did not know whose house it was. The GPS on her phone, cracked screen held together with the same electrical tape as her sneakers, gave her an address and nothing else. She parked the diner's ancient Corolla 2 blocks away because the driveway was already full of black cars, and she walked the rest of the way with the foil pan warm against her stomach, the smell of braised beef and thyme rising up to meet the cedar and diesel smell of the neighborhood itself, a smell that told her, even before she reached the door, that she'd wandered somewhere she didn't belong. She knocked at what she thought was the service entrance. Nobody answered. She tried the handle, found it unlocked, and stepped into a mudroom that led to a kitchen, because that's where deliveries went. That's where they always went. 11 years of habit, walking her forward before her instincts could catch up and stop her. She walked into 11 raised hands, a man with a gun on a marble counter 3 feet from a rack of cooling lamb, and a silence so total she could hear the second hand on the stove's clock ticking against the low hum of the heat lamp. "Sit the pan down and go," Salvatore said. Quiet. The kind of quiet that had ended arguments permanently before. The kind of quiet 11 men in that room had learned to fear more than shouting. She did not go. She looked past him instead, at the lamb, at the way it had been trussed. Badly. One shoulder undercooked, the fat unrendered on the left side because whoever plated it under the heat lamp had panicked and pulled it 11 minutes early. A mistake Rosa could read the way another person reads handwriting. "Your cook rushed it," she said. "Somebody's making him nervous." The room went dead. Not one breath moved. Somewhere down the hall, a grandfather clock, the kind of ostentatious thing rich men buy to fill silence they don't know how to fill any other way, ticked through 4 full seconds that felt, to everyone in the kitchen, like 40. Salvatore Greco, who had not been surprised by anything in 11 years, turned his head, slowly, like a door on an old hinge that hadn't been used in a decade. "What did you say?" "The lamb." She set the foil pan down because her hands needed somewhere to be, and reached past a man twice her size to lift the heat lamp's lid, exposing the rack, the white unrendered fat catching the light. See the fat cap? Still white, still stiff. It should be translucent by now, soft, giving a little under a fork. He pulled it early. He panicked. Somebody in this room made him panic, and it wasn't the meat that scared him. She looked at the 11 men, one at a time, unhurried, the way she'd once been trained to plate a dish, with attention, with order, and let her eyes land, finally, on Bruno, whose hands were shaking in a way none of the others were. A tremor a scared cook could read, the way a scared cook reads everything, because a scared cook has spent a career learning fear's specific vocabulary in 100 different bodies. Him. He's been sweating since before I walked in. That's not gun sweat. Gun sweat is even, all over, cold. That's phone call sweat. That's the kind that starts at the back of the neck first. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, delivered the way she delivered the specials board at Lucchese's, flat and unhurried. And it was somehow worse than an accusation, because it came from someone with nothing to gain from the lie and nothing to lose from the truth. Silence. A long one. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. The heat lamp hummed on, indifferent, cooking a rack of lamb that nobody in that room would ever eat. Salvatore Greco, Don of the Naples family, dangerous, rich, untouchable, feared by men who had never once seen him lift his voice, stood in his own kitchen and had nothing to say. For the first time in a very long time, nothing came. His mouth opened, a fraction, and closed again. The gun on the counter sat exactly where he'd left it, forgotten for 4 full seconds by the one man in the city who never forgot anything. "Get her out of here," someone finally said. Not Salvatore, one of the other men, a voice thin with the particular fear of a man who has just watched a rule get broken and doesn't know what happens next. "No," Salvatore said. Quiet again, but a different quiet. "She stays until I say otherwise." He looked at Bruno. "Who'd you call?" Bruno's mouth worked, nothing coming out, and in the silence that followed, Rosa understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has spent a career reading kitchens, that she had just changed the shape of somebody's night, possibly somebody's life, and there was no way to unknow the lamb, no way to hand back what she'd already seen. They let her go that night. Salvatore walked her to the door himself, which 2 of the men in the room seemed to find stranger than anything that had happened with the lamb, and at the threshold he said only, "What's your name?" "Rosa." "You a chef, Rosa?" "I'm whatever gets called in when a driver has a flat." He almost smiled. Almost. "Somebody'll be in touch." "Don't bother," she said, and meant it, and walked the 2 blocks back to the Corolla with her heart going so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her teeth. And she did not look back. Not once, though every instinct in her told her someone was watching to see if she would. He offered her money first, 3 days later, because money was the language he trusted most, and $5,000 for one night's observation was, to him, a rounding error smaller than the tip he'd have left at a restaurant that impressed him. A man she recognized from the kitchen delivered the offer, in an envelope, at the diner, sliding it across the counter like a check for services rendered. "No," Rosa said, not touching it. "It's not a trick, it's a thank you. I don't take thank yous. I can't explain to a tax auditor." She slid the envelope back. "Tell him no, politely, however you people do politely." The man left without another word, and Rosa spent the rest of her shift certain she'd made a terrible mistake, the kind of mistake poor people aren't supposed to be allowed to make, turning down money because of a principle nobody was going to remember she'd had once she was 3 months further behind on rent. 3 days passed, then 4. Petrosky's Friday came and went. She paid $200 of the $340 and got a look instead of a note, which she understood, correctly, as a countdown rather than a reprieve. Dom cut her hours temporarily, which in the language of Lucchese's meant permanently, slower, a phrase he delivered without meeting her eyes. Butcher finished the salmon pâté, and she stood in the bodega aisle doing math against a can that cost $1.79 more than she had budgeted, holding it in her hand for a long moment before putting it back and buying the chicken instead, promising herself she'd watch him closely, promising herself it would be fine. On the 5th night, a black car sat outside the laundromat with its lights off, and a man she recognized from the kitchen, not Bruno, one of the quiet ones, rolled the window down 4 inches. Mr. Greco would like a conversation. Not an offer, a conversation. I have work at 6. He knows. She got in anyway, because $340 doesn't stop being $340 just because you're proud, and because some part of her, the part that used to plate food that stopped men mid-sentence, wanted to know what a conversation with a man like that even sounded like when there wasn't a gun on the counter. The house at night smelled different than it had the week before. Less cedar and diesel, more wood smoke, a fire going somewhere she couldn't see. Salvatore met her not in the kitchen, but in a study lined with books she doubted he'd read. A glass of something amber, already poured and untouched on the desk in front of him. "You turned down $5,000, he said, without preamble. "I turned down a reason for someone to ask me questions later. That's not what most people would call it. Most people don't have a landlord who leaves notes instead of talking to them." She stayed standing, arms crossed, close enough to the door to remember it was there. "What's the conversation?" "I need someone in my kitchens who notices things, not a spy." He said the word carefully, the way a man handles something he's been warned might be loaded. "A cook, on payroll. Actual payroll, taxes withheld, the kind of paper trail that protects you instead of exposing you. I run 40, 50 dinners a year where the wrong detail in the wrong dish tells me something I'd otherwise have to beat out of somebody. You saw a fat cap and told me a man was lying before he opened his mouth. I don't have anybody else who can do that." "Taxes," she said. "Real ones. W-2, not envelope. W-2. I keep my license. I keep my apartment. I'm not living in that house. Not moving anywhere near that house. Nobody asked you to. And if I see something I don't want to see, I get to not say anything, and nobody holds that against me." He was quiet for a moment, turning the glass in slow circles on the desk without drinking from it. "That one I can't promise. If you're in my kitchen and you see something, I'm going to want to know what you saw. That's the job." She said no, a 3rd time that night, standing in the doorway of the study, with her hand already on the frame, and she meant it hard enough that she walked the whole way home, 4 miles, in the cold, because she didn't trust herself to sit quietly in the back of one of his cars and not change her mind before she reached her own block. For 6 days she went back to being nobody's cook but Lucchese's. She picked up the shifts Dom had cut, worked doubles until her wrist ached in the old, familiar way, and told herself the ache was proof she'd made the right decision. That, whatever else was true about her life, at least it was hers, unclaimed, unbought. She fed Butcher the store-brand chicken and did the math on the wine and let the 11 blocks home stretch out under her feet the way they always had. And for 6 days it almost worked, almost felt like enough. Then Petrosky's 4th note came, and this one wasn't yellow. It was typed, on letterhead, from an office instead of a landlord's own hand, and it used the word proceedings in a sentence that made the room tilt slightly around her. She sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her lap, and Butcher pressed warm against her hip and did the arithmetic one more time, the same arithmetic she'd been doing for months, and found, as she always found, that there was no version of it that came out even. The black car was outside the laundromat again 2 nights later, though she hadn't called anyone, hadn't reached out, hadn't done anything to summon it, which told her, more than anything else could have, that Salvatore had simply been waiting, patient the way water is patient with stone, certain the letter, or something like it, would eventually arrive. She got in. "I'm not doing this because I trust you," she said, before he could say anything at all. "I didn't ask you to. I'm doing it because the alternative is worse, and I need you to understand that the day the alternative stops being worse, I'm gone." No conversation, no warning. Understood. He didn't smile, didn't reach for her, didn't do any of the things a lesser man might have done to seal a moment like that. He simply nodded, once, the way he might have closed a deal with somebody he respected. "W2 starts Monday." She said yes twice more that night, weighing the shape of the trap even as she felt herself leaning into it. And when she finally meant it, sitting in the back of that car, watching Delancey Street slide past the window, it felt exactly like she'd known it would. Like stepping onto ice that had held someone else's weight and hoping it would hold hers too. A beautiful trap, and she walked into it with her eyes open because $340 had become a letter with the word proceedings in it. And this was a door, and doors, unlike walls, could be walked back out of. She told herself that. She almost believed it. The first 2 weeks were smaller than she expected. No more guns on counters, no more men with their hands laced behind their heads. Just kitchens, 3 of them, rotating, each one larger and better equipped than anything Lucchese's could have dreamed of. Copper pans hanging in neat rows, a walk-in stocked with cuts of meat she'd only ever seen in magazines. She learned the rhythms of a staff of 9, learned which of them talked too much and which of them didn't talk at all, learned that the house ran on a schedule as precise as a hospital's, meals timed to the minute, because men who lived the way these men lived did not tolerate surprises at the table, only surprises everywhere else. She earned her keep quietly. A dish sent back untouched, a nervous hand on a knife, a guest who ate everything except the bread. She learned to read these the way she'd once read the fat cap on that first rack of lamb, and she reported what she saw, only when asked, and only in the fewest words possible, because fewer words meant less that could be twisted later. Salvatore watched her work more than he needed to. She noticed. She said nothing about it. The second test came 5 weeks after she started, at a summit dinner for men whose names never appeared in newspapers. 42 plates that had to go out in a synchronized wave because the men eating them measured respect in seconds of delay. A room of capos and consiglières from 3 families who did not trust each other enough to eat slowly. Salvatore had explained the stakes to her 2 nights before, standing over a prep table while she broke down a case of branzino, his voice pitched low even though the kitchen was empty. 3 families hadn't sat at the same table in 6 years, not since a dispute over a stretch of waterfront in Sunset Park had nearly turned into something nobody could have walked back from. This dinner was supposed to be the beginning of a peace nobody entirely trusted, brokered over branzino and osso buco, because men like these had long ago learned that breaking bread together, however performative, was cheaper than burying each other. "Nothing goes wrong tonight," he'd told her. "Not the food, not the timing, not anything you can control." She had understood, without him spelling it out further, that the things she couldn't control were exactly what he was asking her to watch for. She had spent the 2 days before the dinner walking the guest list in her head the way she used to walk her own bank balance. 42 names, 42 seats, cross-referenced against a family tree of grudges Salvatore had sketched for her on the back of a menu, because nothing about this dinner could be written down anywhere more permanent than paper he intended to burn. She memorized which men hadn't spoken in years. She memorized which ones had lost brothers, cousins, sons, to which other families at the table, memorized it the way she'd once memorized mise en place, until the whole bloody architecture of the evening sat behind her eyes, ready to be read the moment it started moving. Rosa ran the pass that night. She had earned that, in 5 weeks, on nothing but instinct and hands that didn't shake even when Salvatore stood 8 feet behind her with his arms crossed, watching the way he'd watched every service since the lamb. Though this time, the watching felt different, felt like a test rather than a habit. The kitchen moved like a machine that night. 42 plates of branzino and 42 plates of osso buco, timed to leave the pass in a single continuous wave, no plate more than 11 seconds behind the one before it. A rhythm Rosa had drilled into the staff for a week, leading up to the dinner, because she understood without being told, that a broken rhythm in that room would read as an insult nobody would forgive. Plate 17 came back untouched, not disliked, untouched, a distinction Rosa clocked in half a second the way she'd clocked the lamb, because a man who dislikes food pushes it around the plate, cuts into it, leaves evidence of trying, and a man who's been told not to eat it doesn't touch it at all, doesn't even pick up the fork. She didn't say anything to the room. She said it to Salvatore, quietly, at the edge of the pass, 4 words. 17 didn't eat. His eyes went to seat 17, a cousin of Bruno's. Bruno himself long gone from the family's rosters by then. The details of his departure never discussed aloud in front of Rosa, a silence she'd learned not to ask into. Seated 2 down from where Bruno had once stood in a kitchen, sweating a tremor she'd read like a menu. Salvatore didn't raise his voice. He never did. He set his fork down, the same quiet gesture as the gun on the counter, weeks and a lifetime ago, and said, to no one and everyone, take him to get some air. 2 men moved, unhurried, the way men move when they've done this before, and know exactly how it's supposed to look to the rest of the room. Casual, brief, nothing to see. The dinner continued. Nobody at the table so much as paused between bites, which told Rosa more about the room than anything anyone had said aloud. That this, whatever this was routine here, was simply the shape the evening took when it needed to. Later, in the hallway, well past midnight, after the last car had pulled out of the circular drive, she found her hands trembling for the first time since the lamb. A tremor she pressed flat against her own thighs until it stopped. You didn't ask what happens to him, Salvatore said, appearing the way he always appeared, without the sound of arriving, a man who moved through his own house like a draft. I don't want to know. That's the right answer. It's not an answer, it's a wall I'm putting up. She looked at him directly, which she still didn't do often, because looking at him directly meant admitting she'd started to see a person instead of a headline. Am I going to be asked to do this again? Read a room and watch somebody get walked out for air? Yes. Do I get a say in when I stop? No, he said. And then, after a pause that surprised her more than the answer itself, but you'll always know when it's happening. I won't hide that part from you. Everything else in this house, maybe. Not that. It was, she would realize much later, the closest thing to a promise he ever gave her, and at the time she didn't know whether to find it comforting or the most dangerous thing anyone had ever said to her. The dinner itself finished without another incident. 39 remaining plates cleared in the same unbroken rhythm. Coffee poured at 12:58 a.m., exactly as the schedule Rosa had drawn up required, and by 1:30, the last car had pulled out of the circular drive, carrying men who, as far as any of them would ever say aloud, had simply eaten a very good meal together. Whatever peace had or hadn't been brokered that night lived now in rooms Rosa wasn't allowed into, decisions made over cigars in the study while she scrubbed down a kitchen built to look, by morning, as though nothing at all had happened in it. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed the house kept made up for her on nights she worked too late to go home, still in her chef's whites, and thought about seat 17's cousin, whose name she'd never bothered to learn because not knowing it felt, at the time, like a kind of protection. It didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like a debt she'd have to pay eventually, in a currency she hadn't agreed to. She thought, too, about the 11 blocks home on 9th Street, about Butcher curled on a bed that didn't cost what this one probably did, about a version of herself 6 weeks younger who would not have recognized the woman sitting in this room at 2 in the morning, still tasting fear at the back of her throat and understanding, for the first time with total clarity, that she had traded one kind of danger for another and told herself it was an upgrade. Winter came early that year, the first hard freeze landing in October instead of December, and the city's rhythms shifted the way they always did. Steam rising harder off manhole covers, breath visible on 9th Street where Rosa still, on her days away from Salvatore's houses, went back to check on Dom's diner, less out of loyalty than out of a stubborn refusal to let one life fully replace another. Dom, for his part, had started calling her by her actual name, a change so abrupt and unexplained that Rosa suspected, correctly, that someone had made a call on her behalf, A call she never asked about, because asking would have meant admitting how much of her old life now ran on the goodwill of a man she still wasn't sure she trusted. Petrovsky's note stopped too. She paid her rent on time for the first time in 4 years, in full, on the first of the month, and stood in front of her own door afterward, feeling strange and unmoored, the way people feel when a chronic pain finally, unexpectedly, goes quiet. Butcher ate the chicken now, whichever bag she wanted, and did not get sick. None of it felt like enough to explain away what she was doing to earn it. She had learned by then the specific choreography of Salvatore's other kitchens, a townhouse in Bay Ridge used for smaller, quieter meetings, a restaurant on the water in Sheepshead Bay that operated as a legitimate business 6 nights a week, and something else entirely on the 7th. She had learned which of his men drank and which of them didn't, which ones flinched at the sound of a dropped pan, and which ones didn't flinch at anything at all. A distinction she'd come to understand mattered more than any of them let on. She had learned Salvatore's own habits too, in the accumulating way you learn anyone you spend enough hours in a room with, that he ate slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself were a weakness he'd trained out of himself decades ago, that he never sat with his back to a door, that he asked after Butcher, by name, on the rare mornings she came in late because the cat had been sick in the night, a small kindness that unsettled her more than any of his silences ever had. There were nights, in that stretch of early winter, when she caught herself standing at the pass in one of his kitchens, hands moving through a plating sequence on pure muscle memory, and felt something dangerously close to peace, the specific satisfaction of a room running exactly as it should, of being good at something and being seen being good at it, a feeling Lucchese's had never once given her in 11 years. She hated how much she'd started to need that feeling. She hated it the way you hate a drug that stopped pretending to be optional. The intimacy beat came on a Tuesday, which felt wrong to Rosa, because nothing that quiet should happen on a Tuesday should happen on the same day of the week she used to walk 11 blocks home to save $2.75. The kitchen was empty at 1 a.m., the big house gone silent the way only very large, very guarded houses go silent, every silence purchased and patrolled by men stationed at the gate and along the seawall. Men Rosa had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing furniture. Salvatore poured 2 glasses of something dark and expensive that Rosa didn't recognize by label because she'd never been able to afford to learn labels like that. An amber liquid that smelled, when she finally raised the glass, of oak and something faintly like burnt orange peel. "You have a burn," he said, nodding at her wrist, where a week-old line ran pale and pink against her skin, the ghost of a friar's edge. Friar, occupational hazard. He reached across the counter, not fast, not slow, and touched 2 fingers to the mark, light enough that it wasn't really a touch at all, more the idea of one, more a question than a gesture. Her pulse did something in her throat she chose not to name. "My mother had a burn like that," he said. "Same wrist, same side. She ran a stove for 30 years in a kitchen half the size of this one before she ran anything else." He said it like an admission, which for a man who never admitted things, it was. She used to say a burn that never fades is the only diploma that means anything. "Where'd you grow up?" "A block. You'd recognize the smell of. Fry oil and diesel. Same as you. My father drove a truck he didn't own, for a man who owned everything. I used to think that was the whole shape of a life, driving something that belonged to somebody else." He turned the glass in his hand without drinking. "It took me a long time to stop driving somebody else's truck. Is that supposed to make me trust you more or less? I don't know yet." A pause, longer than any he'd let sit between them before. "Does it?" She didn't answer right away. The refrigerator hummed somewhere behind her, the only sound in the room besides their own breathing, and she found herself studying the lines at the corners of his eyes, the grey threading through hair that had probably once been as dark as hers, looking for the boy from the block that smelled like fry oil, and diesel underneath the man who'd stood over a rack of lamb with a gun 3 feet away, and finding, unsettlingly, that both of them were there at once, neither one cancelling the other out. "Ask me again in a month," she said finally, which wasn't a no, and they both understood that it wasn't. "You're the only person in this house who talks to me like I might say the wrong thing back." he said. Everyone else here has spent years making sure I never hear a sentence I don't already agree with. That sounds lonely. It is. He said it simply, without asking for sympathy, the way he said most things, a fact laid on the counter between them like a plate set down. I didn't know it was lonely until you started arguing with me about lamb. She almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere before it fully arrived. I wasn't arguing, I was right. You were right, he agreed. That's what made it unbearable. A ghost of something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. Most people who work for me learn very quickly to stop noticing things. You went the other direction. I didn't have a choice. Noticing things is the only skill I've got that pays. It's not the only one, he said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain, without the practiced weight he used on everyone else in that house, made her look up at him fully for the first time all night. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The glass sweated a ring onto the marble. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled, the house breathing the way old houses do, and the moment passed the way a held breath finally releases. Not resolved, just postponed, the air between them still carrying whatever had almost happened, unspoken and unfinished. I should sleep, Rosa said. I open at 6, still, some mornings. Old habits. I know. He didn't move to stop her. Rosa. She paused at the doorway. Thank you. For the lamb. For all of it since. It was, she realized, the first time he had ever thanked her for anything, and the plainness of it, no envelope, no rounding error offer, landed harder than $5,000 ever could have. Don't get used to me saying you're welcome, she said, and left the glass half full on the counter, and he watched her go, the way a man watches a door he isn't sure will open again, and neither of them said the thing that had, for 4 seconds, sat in the air between them, clear as a held knife. It was 3 weeks after that night that the ledger surfaced. An old one, water-stained, recovered from a storage unit in Canarsie during a dispute over property that had nothing, on its face, to do with Salvatore's mother at all. The unit had belonged, decades earlier, to a bookkeeper named Alphonse, who died of natural causes 8 years back, a man nobody in the current organization had thought about twice until his estranged nephew tried to sell the unit's contents to cover a gambling debt, and one of Salvatore's men, doing due diligence on the sale, recognized the handwriting on a stack of yellowed receipts. The ledger itself was unremarkable. Years of shipping manifests, numbers that meant nothing to anyone without the right context. It was Rosa who found the loose page tucked inside its spine, going through the box on Salvatore's instruction, because she had, by then, proven herself the one person in the house whose eye for a wrong detail nobody thought to doubt. The page didn't match the rest of the ledger's handwriting. It had been added later, deliberately, by someone who wanted it found by exactly the right person at exactly the right time, and had simply been waiting 11 years for that person to exist. A confession, disguised as an accounting note, a name written in the margin beside a date that made Rosa's stomach drop the moment she cross-referenced it against a story Salvatore had told her, once, in fragments, about the night his mother had died. She read the page 4 times before she let herself believe what it said. Then she read it a 5th time, because believing it meant understanding that the man she'd spent months learning to trust had spent 11 years grieving a lie, had buried a man for a crime that page suggested he hadn't committed, and that somewhere in his organization, possibly in his own kitchen, possibly at his own table, the person who had actually done it was still walking around, still being served branzino, still being trusted with things Rosa herself hadn't yet earned the right to know. She almost didn't show him. She sat with it for 2 full days, in her own apartment, Butcher curled against her hip, turning the page over in her hands, and understanding, with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever was written on it was going to end somebody's life, and that once she said the words out loud, she could never unsay them, could never go back to being simply a cook who read runes for a living. She thought about walking away. She thought about the 11 blocks she used to walk to save $2.75, about the woman who'd been furniture at Lucchese's, about how far away that woman now felt, and how close she still was. Underneath everything, to going back to being her. She thought about the 2 fingers on her wrist, and the burn that never fades being the only diploma that means anything. And she understood, finally, that she had stopped being someone who could walk away weeks ago. Maybe the moment she lifted the lid off that heat lamp and told a room full of dangerous men that somebody in it was lying. She brought him the page on a Thursday night, standing in the study where he'd once offered her a conversation instead of an offer, and she watched something in his face come apart and reassemble itself into a shape she'd never seen on him before. Not the quiet menace, not the almost smile, something rawer, older, a boy's face surfacing briefly under 51 years of practiced stillness before he folded it away again. He didn't say anything for a long time. He read the page twice, the way she had, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual weight behind it. "I buried the wrong man. You buried the man everyone told you to bury. Same thing, in this house." He gave her no instructions that night, asked her to do nothing, said only that he needed 3 days, and for 3 days the house ran exactly as it always had. Dinners plated, plates cleared, nothing in the rhythm of the place suggesting that its owner was quietly unraveling 11 years of certainty, one conversation at a time. Conversations Rosa wasn't present for and didn't ask about, because some walls, she'd learned, were hers to keep up even now. On the 3rd night, word came down that everyone was to be in the main kitchen by midnight. No reason given. Rosa understood. Walking down the hallway toward that kitchen with her stomach in a knot she recognized from months ago, standing in a doorway with a foil pan of short ribs, that whatever came next would not be undone by a plate of lamb or a quiet word at the pass. This was the room she'd been reading toward the whole time, and she was about to find out exactly what all that reading had been for. Midnight arrived with the particular cold that comes off water in late autumn, a cold that got into the stone house's kitchen, despite the heat lamp humming over a station where a young cook named Marcus, 20 years old, hands too steady for how scared he clearly was, stood with his back against the counter and his eyes on the gun in Salvatore's hand. Marcus had made a phone call 3 days earlier that he believed private, a call about the ledger page, about who else might know what it said, a call made out of fear rather than betrayal, though fear and betrayal, in that house, were not always treated as different things. "At midnight," Salvatore said, quiet, the gun steady, aimed at a boy who suddenly looked 12 years old instead of 20. "Somebody in this house is going to tell me who really killed my mother, because I know it wasn't the man I buried for it 11 years ago. I've known for 3 days. I've been waiting to hear somebody in this room say it out loud." The room went the particular still that Rosa now recognized as the sound just before something broke permanently. The same stillness from the night with the lamb, except this time she wasn't a stranger walking in with a foil pan. This time, she was the one who'd found the page. She stepped forward, not because she'd been asked, because she'd spent 5 weeks and then some reading rooms for this family. And this was the room she'd been reading toward the whole time without knowing it. Every fat cap and every untouched plate, a rehearsal for this exact silence. "It wasn't him," she said, nodding at Marcus, her voice even, flat, the same voice she'd used for the lamb. "He panicked and made a call because he found the page and didn't know what to do with it. That's not the same as knowing." She looked at Salvatore directly, the way she'd learned to over the past months, no longer afraid of what she'd see there. "You already know who it was. You've known for 3 days. You're pointing that at him because it's easier than pointing it at the truth. Say the name," Salvatore said, quiet, quieter than she'd ever heard him. She said it, a name that made every man in the kitchen, including Salvatore, go the color of old paper, a name attached to a face that had sat at more than one of those 42-plate dinners, a name Rosa had served food to with her own hands and never once suspected, because the ledger page didn't lie the way a nervous cook's fat cap didn't lie. It simply sat there, patient, waiting 11 years for the right person to turn it over. The gun didn't move, not yet. His finger stayed where it was, on a trigger aimed at a boy who had done nothing but be afraid. And for 4 full seconds, nobody in that kitchen breathed, including Rosa, who had just with 11 words, rewritten the only story Salvatore Greco had ever let himself believe about the worst night of his life. He turned to look at her instead of the boy. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, the burnt sugar and bleach smell rising off them the way it always did, the smell that had never once left, not through months of marble counters and 42-plate dinners, and a wrist that still remembered the ghost of 2 fingers. "Somebody should turn off that heat lamp," she said. "You're going to dry out the lamb again." Rosa Calder walked into a kitchen with a foil pan of short ribs and walked out, months later, holding the one piece of information that could end a war Salvatore Greco didn't know he was still fighting. She'd arrived $340 short for rent and a stranger to every name in that house. She left standing between a scared boy and a loaded gun. The only person in the room, the Don of the Naples family, had ever let talk him out of anything. Whether she just saved a scared boy's life or handed a dangerous man exactly the excuse he'd been circling for 11 years is a question even she couldn't answer standing in that kitchen at midnight, the heat lamp humming, the gun still not lowered. Where does her name go from here? Into his ledger or into his life? Let me know what you think happens next in the comments. If you want to see how deep this goes, like this video, share it with someone who loves a story that doesn't let go, and subscribe with the bell for the next chapter.